During a game's development, there are almost countless things that can go wrong, leading to it not quite living up to the expectations it had going in. Whether that be due to mismanagement from the higher-ups, a lack of budget and time to make the game as it was envisioned, or just classic incompetence. However, what's rarer is a time where a game could have done well, or at the very least been far greater than the final result, if it wasn't for one single design choice that held everything else back from reaching its potential. So how about we take a look at some of these disastrous oddities and boneheaded moves, as I present to you some of the most stupid decisions that ruined games. Let's start things off with a game that you're either not familiar with at all, or you already know why it's here the moment you saw the title card. For those uninformed, originally releasing as a PlayStation exclusive in 1999, Driver is a vehicle action game made by Reflections Interactive and published by GT Interactive, which sees you play as undercover cop and former race car driver John Tanner, who's sent in to infiltrate and investigate a crime syndicate across 4 cities. Whilst the franchise has lost a bit of its luster over time, primarily thanks to a mix of the last main entry releasing over a decade ago, and a shockingly terrible third game, when it released, Driver was one of the first big names in the open world genre, with it often being compared to the GTA series, which wouldn't transition to 3D for another 2 years, and in the end managed to sell over 3 million copies on the PS1 alone, its success leading to ports for PC, as well as a handheld conversion for the Game Boy Color. Now, I wouldn't blame you if from that description, you'd be very confused on why exactly this game is here, given both its sales and reviews were really good. Well, that's because a sizable amount of the people who played the game didn't actually get that far owing to a very poorly designed tutorial. How it works is that you're dropped into a car park and are tasked with completing a list of maneuvers within a time limit, the whole thing actually being based on a scene from one of the game's main inspirations, the 1978 crime thriller The Driver. Sounds simple, right? Well, unfortunately there's 2 major problems here. First is that the game doesn't actually tell you how to do these maneuvers, or what they even are, with the slalom mission specifically confusing a lot of players who had no idea what the game was actually asking them to do. And secondly, the time limit is so strict that even if you do manage to figure out what you're supposed to do, there's a decent chance you might not be able to do all of it fast enough, especially since you can still fail the tutorial if you crash the car too many times. This ended up creating a bizarre scenario where not only does it fail to do an adequate job of actually teaching you how to play, but it also makes the tutorial arguably the hardest section of the game, with the only point it gets remotely close to being that difficult again being the final mission. So despite the good sales, a large portion of players never managed to get past this car park and experience the rest of the game owing to this massive difficulty spike right at the start, making for an incredibly bad first impression for what was otherwise a really good game. If there's anything good I can say about the tutorial, it's at the very least memorable, if for all the wrong reasons, and at least future entries would avoid this problem so you could actually play them. Whether that's actually a good thing in Driver 3's case, I'll let you decide. Whilst Driver is still commonly agreed as being pretty good regardless of its bad opening, without sugarcoating things, Bubsy 3D is commonly agreed as being a potential candidate for the worst 3D platformer, worst PS1 game, and in general one of the worst video games ever made. It has garnered this reputation thanks to an awful camera, bland environments, terrible controls, and the fact that Bubsy just refuses to shut up. Hell, I didn't even need to list those reasons out. I could have just shown you to 10 seconds of unaltered gameplay footage, and you can immediately pick up why this game's reputation is so abysmal. But if I am to be as generous as humanly possible, some of these gameplay issues can be blamed on the fact that the game's developers, Eidetic, didn't really know what they were doing, as 3D platformers just weren't a thing yet. With both the development and release of Bubsy 3D happening around the same time as both Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot, the two games that effectively defined how almost all 3D platformers would be made from that point forward. Should stress, this doesn't suddenly excuse the game's terrible quality or make it secretly good, but it can explain why it turned out the way it did. What's less excusable is the reason behind the game's lackluster presentation and level design, which consists of these massive open spaces made up of generic textureless blocks and hills with next to nothing in them outside of the collectible atoms. Something that, even if the game played remotely well, would still make it look like garbage compared to almost any other platformer from the era, or hell, just any other game releasing on the PS1. Well, this unfinished look can be pinned on the team's bizarre decision to make Bubsy 3D in the highest resolution possible on the system, which is referred to as the interlace mode, which is where, in order to show a larger picture without sacrificing the frame rate, it's split into two sets of scan lines which are filled in alternatively every half frame. Now, most games that used this high resolution only did so for things such as menu screens or pre-rendered movies, as using it in gameplay sections can chew through a lot of the system's memory. So naturally, because Eidetic decided to make the entire game in this interlace resolution for literally no other reason than because no one else was, this meant that whilst the game would often run fine on their development kits, once they tried to get it to play on a retail console, it just couldn't handle the mix of the high resolution and the massive levels they were building for it. This is not only the reason why a lot of the game's environments are untextured, but it's also the reasoning behind the game's low draw distance and why, despite the level's large size, there's almost nothing in them, because owing to all the memory going to support the resolution, there was none left to support anything else going on, which, combined with the fact that the game was rushed out by its publisher Accolade, who were desperate for money, resulted in the game's general look of a beta test stage. If Eidetic had chosen to make the game at a lower resolution, it's likely they would have been able to not only make a game closer to their original vision, but it's possible they would have also had more time to iron out the kinks of the gameplay, or at the very least make the levels more interesting, turning a terrible game to one that at the very least could be described as playable. Sort of like what the refurbished edition of Bubsy 3D from the Bubsy Perfect collection seems to be aiming for. By the way, if you're wondering what happened to Eidetic after this, they're actually still around today, however they go by a different name nowadays, namely as PlayStation's Bend Studio, meaning that the company responsible for one of the worst games ever made is the same one responsible for the Siphon Filter series, as well as titles like Resistance Retribution, Uncharted Golden Abyss, and Days Gone. I'd say with that resume they've more than made up for their sins. Moving on from arguably one of the best redemption arcs of a game studio to arguably one of the biggest fall-offs, we're now going to take a look at Midway, one of many companies who saw great success during the 80s and 90s, but then just couldn't figure out how to adapt to home consoles once the arcade market died down. No matter what Midway tried during this era, they just could never recapture their previous success. The only real exception being the franchise they were most famous for, Mortal Kombat, which even then, this post-arcade era of MK, referred to as the 3D era, is generally viewed as being rather mixed in the grand scheme of things. As well as it definitely has its fans, to most it was either a time where the series had some good ideas that just weren't executed the best, or at the more extreme end was the series' dark age, with it only getting saved after it was decided to do a full-scale reboot in 2011. It's within this supposed dark age that we have our topic of interest, Mortal Kombat vs DC Universe, a crossover that no one particularly expected, or realistically were asking for, but at least could be interesting, and maybe even be the shot in the arm Midway needed to save themselves. The idea being that the comic fans they would rope in could then be converted into potential Mortal Kombat fans. Unfortunately, there was one little conflict of interest that kinda got in the way of things. You see, for anyone unfamiliar, Mortal Kombat is one of those franchises where the main appeal, and the thing that makes it stand out from the competition, is its over-the-top gore and violence, best exemplified by the series' fatalities, finishing moves in which you get to brutally murder the opponent. Now, whilst this likely wouldn't be a problem for the DC villains like Joker and Deathstroke, a lot of the DC heroes either try their best to avoid killing people, or even have personal vows to never take another's life. And given you can't really do a full-scale crossover game like this without characters like Batman and Superman, this proved to be a big problem. So what was Midway's solution? Stick with the characters who don't really care about killing people? Set in an alternate universe where the heroes are more trigger-happy? Scrap the idea entirely? No. Instead, they decided the best solution was to just completely neuter the franchise's most iconic feature. Not only are all the fatalities featured in MK vs DC some of the most toned down and least violent finishes possible, with characters like Kano going from ripping out people's hearts to jumping on them really hard, but the DC heroes were given their own unique finishes of heroic brutalities, where they don't kill people, just really hurt them. Though given how toned down and neutered the regular fatalities are, there's no real point in giving the distinguishing name. While this may have allowed the crossover to even happen, and arguably helped widen the potential new audience thanks to the teen rating the game got in America, it also massively pissed off the pre-established fanbase who weren't too happy about their favorite series effectively being censored to facilitate a crossover they weren't even asking for. Whilst the game did still do good numbers, reportedly selling around 2 million copies, it wasn't the Hail Mary save Midway were aiming for, the company ultimately going bankrupt with most of their assets getting bought by Warner Brothers, with MK vs DC often standing as the most divisive entry in the MK franchise, its lasting legacy being a desperate last-ditch effort for relevancy by riding the coattails of a more popular franchise at the cost of losing its own identity. Had Midway gone with the original concept of a darker reboot, or maybe even just doing a crossover with a franchise or brand whose characters are far more open to the idea of murder, like the various action and horror movie characters who have shown up in more recent entries, and maybe they might still be around today. Okay, that's admittedly wishful thinking given how much money they were bleeding, but still. Plus, to look on the bright side a bit, a lot of the ideas the team had with this game, most notably the cinematic story mode, whilst not being great in MK vs DC, would still be incorporated into later games, with the MK dev team, now known as NetherRealm Studios, continuing to work with Detective Comics on the Injustice series, along with both MK and DC characters showing up in each other's games as guest DLC fighters. So it's evident that, whilst not a bright spot by any stretch of the imagination, the team responsible do seem to have some level of affection for their work, which isn't something I can say about the last game I'll be discussing. To end things off today, let's discuss how one business mandate almost single-handedly killed one of the most iconic crossover fighters in video game history. Now, I'm going to assume most people watching this know what Marvel vs. Capcom is, but if you somehow don't, the fast version is that it's a series of team-based fighting games which sees the heroes and villains of Marvel Comics do battle with some of the most iconic characters to come from Capcom. The series having a long history in the competitive gaming scene, with with titles like MVC2 and Ultimate MVC3, along with appealing to casuals who just find the idea of Spider-Man fighting Dante to be really cool. So naturally, when the fourth game was announced, titled Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, people were understandably very excited, especially given this was around the same time the Marvel Cinematic Universe was near the peak of its popularity. However, as more and more of the game started being shown, eyebrows started raising, namely with skepticism over Capcom's decision to prioritize showcasing the new story mode over the actual fighting, especially when said choice highlighted how awful certain character models looked, most infamously Chun-Li, which wasn't good for a series known for its great presentation. However, this, as well as the initially controversial decision to drop the 3v3 format for 2v2, whilst upsetting to hardcore fans, could still easily appeal to casual audiences. That is, until people noticed something suspicious going on with the game's roster, notably the bizarre absence of any X-Men or Fantastic Four characters. Whilst the development team would try to explain this away with the characters are functions explanation, which if you don't know is the logic that a character being removed doesn't matter if you can replace them with another one who does the exact same thing as them, anyone with at least half a brain cell could figure out what was going on, as the decision to remove them wasn't because Capcom wanted to highlight other characters who hadn't been featured yet, but instead because of a stupid mandate from Marvel, who are trying their hardest to effectively erase any and all usage of the X-Men and Fantastic Four in external media, even removing the characters from merch. The reason why they did this hasn't been 100% confirmed, but everyone figured out it was a move from Marvel and potentially Disney to artificially devalue the brand in the hopes it would make 20th Century Fox give up the film rights to the characters so they could be incorporated into the MCU. With this belief only getting strengthened by the fact that, despite claims the films didn't play a role in which characters got included, there was only one Marvel character on the base roster who wasn't part of the MCU, 2 if you don't count Ghost Rider's appearance in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and 3 if you also include the DLC character Venom. Safe to say, everyone hated this, as not only are both series home to some of Marvel's most popular and iconic characters, especially prior to the MCU's existence, making it less appealing to casuals, but owing to the fact that the first Marvel Capcom crossover was X-Men vs. Street Fighter, or if you want to go further back, Akuma's appearance as a secret guest character in X-Men Children of the Atom, the whole thing was seen as massively disrespectful to the series' history and origin. To compare it to another crossover game, removing Wolverine, Magneto, and Doctor Doom from Marvel vs. Capcom was like removing Mario, Kirby, and Pikachu from Super Smash Bros. And so, with just a handful of roster omissions, Marvel and Capcom had seemingly managed to unite both sides of the fighting game fanbase under a common goal, and it was to shit on MVC Infinite as much as possible, which only got worse when Bandai Namco and Arc System Works revealed Dragon Ball FighterZ, their own 3v3 fighter based on a licensed property, which seemingly had exponentially more effort put into it. In the end, despite the gameplay of Infinite actually being pretty good, all the negative press that originated from the removal of the X-Men and Fantastic Four cast led MVC Infinite to fall incredibly short of its sales targets, with all future plans for DLC and support being cancelled, the game not even living long enough to be a main stage title at EVO, and for the longest time seemed to have single-handedly killed the series. Luckily, this story does have a happy ending, as in addition to seeing a return with the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection, Infinite has also seen somewhat of a revival with projects like MVC Infinite and Beyond, making the future of the series brighter than ever, showcasing that even at your lowest points, you can always rise back up. Don't really have any kind of ending remark this time around, so here's a random clip from Mortal Kombat Deception.
Oh, my balls!